Welcome back, and here we are for Chapter 7, Section 3, our last section in the chapter. We're going to look at climate and biomes, and realistically we're going to look at terrestrial biomes. These are very similar to ecosystems, but just in a larger picture. Ecosystems can wind up being really small, but when we look at things as a collective, we put them into biomes. So these are going to be very large terrestrial regions. Each one is characterized by a specific type of climate and their plant life. We tend to name them by the plant life, like forests where we have a lot of trees, grasslands where we have a lot of grass, desert with very little plant. But one thing to remember is they're not uniform. Maps may show they're here and here, but they have those ectozones, right? The areas in between. So when you kind of look up close, they can get messy. But we're looking at them from a big picture, what we tend to see the planet, and we can divide the planet up into 7 or 8 different types of biomes, sort of depends on some people's take on it. If you take a look at this picture up here, it's kind of this dome. We're kind of looking at a half of the planet, if you will, the idea. What we're going to do is kind of from the bottom to the top, it's going from being hot to very cold. So the idea is we're looking at along the equator, it's like the planet cut in half. So along the equator at the very bottom, these are the tropical regions. Then you just divide the planet into the thirds. You move up to the middle third, and that's the temperate region, and the very top from the 60th parallel to the 90, the very top of the pole, is the cold region. And then as we kind of move from that side to this side, we're going from a lot of water to very little water. So very broad. I'll start at the tropics, down at the equator. Across where we have a lot of water, we have tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest will tend to give way into grasslands. Now in the tropics, we call these savanna, and then savanna gives way to desert. Not that it happens in this kind of a flow, but that's what we find in the tropics. If there's enough rain, forest. Not enough rain, savanna. Very little rain, desert. Moving up into the temperate zone. The temperate, this is between 30th parallel and 60th, or 30 latitude, 60 latitude. This is the temperate zone. This is the United States. Gainesville, if you're with me in my class, Gainesville, we're just below 30. We're like 29 and change on latitude. So from United States, the base of the United States, not the Florida Peninsula, up to the northern border with Canada, is right at 30 to 60. This is a temperate zone. Hits a lot of Europe as well. And here it ranges from being very hot in the summer to very cold in the winter. So it's temperate. Enough rain, we have a temperate rainforest on the very far side. Temperate rainforest gives way largely to deciduous forest. Deciduous means to fall down, so the leaves fall down or fall off in the deciduous forest. So the deciduous forest gives way to grassland, but we can also find chaparral desert in this area. Chaparral is characterized by near a coastline, but not enough water, so we get this kind of a scrub desert. Scrub desert gives way to grassland. Grassland gives way to desert. Then in the very cold regions, we also, if there's enough rain, we get taiga or boreal forest, conifers, cone-bearing plant, pine trees. That gives way to grassland and desert. And the tundra kind of fits this grassland and sometimes desert. Just depends on how much precipitation the area gets. Well, that's it in a snapshot of a scale of hot to cold, a lot of rain to very little rain. Let's look at a different map. Now this map is kind of a classic where we find these biomes. And on this map, it makes it look like it's really nice and neat. The Sahara Desert is right there, and right below the Sahara Desert, we get the savanna. And this is true, but if you go right on that line, it's hard to tell where the desert truly starts and the savanna truly begins. So this map shows very hard lines, and by and large, this is where we find these types of biomes. Once again, you start getting in close, and it gets more fuzzy. They're not as uniform as they might look. We have white for polar ice caps, and then there's kind of the tundras, kind of a light green, almost looks gray. Then the darker green is this taiga, the evergreen forests, all pine type trees, conifers, hemlocks, etc. This one shows some high regions. Some people refer to it as alpine, so kind of like our Olympic and Rocky Mountains, the Andes Mountains in South America, the Himalayas over in Asia. We see the deserts in the light yellow. The darker yellow, sort of orangey, is our savannas, and then the lightish green is our tropical rainforest by and large. You see a lot of these various things. And if you kind of see that area around the Mediterranean, right above Africa and sort of below Europe proper, it's kind of this red color, and that's our chaparral. It's known as a Mediterranean style climate, and it's where we see a lot of it. We have some on our west coast around San Francisco, this area, but there we go. Biomes, nice and neat, right? Well, let's march through some of these in general, and I'll put some pictures kind of along the way as we go, but the first one we're going to look at is desert. Now, most of these we do wind up having three different types. We have tropical deserts, temperate deserts, and cold deserts. But in any way, all deserts are very vulnerable to disruption because they do not have a great diversity of things living there. It's very limited what can live and grow in a desert. So the plant growth tends to be very slow. We do not have a lot of species diversity. And also because of this, the nutrient cycling is quite slow in a desert. So they're actually very vulnerable when they're disrupted. Whatever disruptions occur last for a really long time. You go drive your four-wheeler across a desert, where those four-wheeler tracks are going to last for a pretty good while because the desert is not very prone to recovering quickly. If we're in a tropical desert, like the one here, there's nothing there. Very hot, very dry. Now, deserts tend to be inland. We don't find them right on the coast typically. They tend to be inland, so the water is not making it in very far and very dry, and we get this kind of true desert, like the Sahara. In the Sahara, this true desert stays hot, never gets down to freezing. Now, in some of these temperate deserts, where we sometimes refer to as scrub deserts, and here I'm throwing up the picture of the saguaro cactus, kind of this classic cactus thing. It's enough rain to get some plant life, but not much. So we find more plant life than in a true desert, if you will. And those cold deserts, which really winds up being tundra. If there's enough tundra, we'll call it kind of a grassland biome. And if there's not enough, then it comes into this true desert area. Some plant life, but not much, mainly dry and barren and rocky a lot of times when it's up in the cold northern areas. Now there is a science focus in this chapter, one of those pull-out kind of page. Once again, do not ignore them. They give you a really nice case study or a specific example which you can use when writing an FRQ. Desert plant adaptations. They have some very specialized features that allow them to live there. Some of these are, most of the plants don't have any leaves, or the leaves are very highly specialized. Sometimes a thorn on a plant is protection, but sometimes that's really the leaf structure. Very little place for water to escape. So no leaves, or very, very small ones, or thick and leathery and waxy if they do have them. The plants there tend to be able to store water, and then they synthesize food in their fleshy stems. They don't have classic leaves to photosynthesize, they do it in their stems. Like the cactus, the whole stem is green. Some of them either have very deep roots to get down into the water, or very shallow and wide roots, so when the rain does come, they're able to absorb it. But once again, a specialized root structure. If they do have leaves, they tend to have very waxy coating leaves, so this reduces how much water can escape. And the seeds will remain inactive, sometimes for years at a time. They lie dormant until water is available. And then when it rains, the seeds very quickly pop open and sprout, and you'll get this really quick bloom within the desert. The animals. Animals are also very highly adapted to live there. Many of them tend to hide in little cool burrows or rocky crevices by day. They don't go out during the day very much. Some of them actually can lie dormant. They can dig down into the ground, stay dormant for the really hot periods, then come out later when it's cooler. Animals like camels can drink massive amounts of water, and then they store it in their fatty tissues to utilize later. And the reptiles that live there, like the types of lizards and snakes that are sort of common, tend to have very thick outer coverings, and this also helps to minimize their loss. In the desert, what happens is when the rain does come, then we get this really beautiful blooming desert for a short period of time. It may only last a few weeks because the seeds all sit there and wait, and when we do get a rain, then everything pops up and sprouts real quickly. The next biome we're going to talk about are grassland biomes. Once again, we can find grasslands in all three areas. We have tropical grasslands, we typically call them savannas, temperate grasslands, and then also the cold, this is going to be the tundra. These areas are too moist to be a desert, but there's not enough precipitation for it to be a forest. So it's this in between. We sometimes do find some trees in a grassland. This is a nice picture of the savanna, a tropical biome, but they're scattered. There's a tree here, there's a tree there. There's not enough. Also, fires are very common in grasslands, and the fire burns through and it kills off the little small tree, because the grass within a few months is full size, but a tree can take years. So I have a small sapling and a fire comes through and it kills the sapling. So only mature trees survive, and not many of them usually do. But in the savanna, you can see we only have the one tree. We have, in this case, some zebra and wildebeest and etc. out in the back. But they tend to have warm temperatures year-round, as you can see from the graph. And the graph is showing the temperature in the red line and the rainfall in the blue. So you can see they have a rainy season and a dry season. Starting in April, May, June, July, August, the summer tends to be very dry, and the rest of the year tends to be wet. Now, I said summer because I'm used to summer, but for them it's warm year-round. They don't really call it summer, winter. It's wet season, dry season. Classic grasslands like we might find in the United States, these are temperate. So they have to be able to survive very cold winters and typically very hot summers. So the tall grass prairies, we have tall, if there's enough rain, we tend to get tall grass. It can literally be like up to your knees or waist height. And if there's not enough, we get short grass prairies. And depending on where they are, we'll kind of go from tall grass to short grass to desert. And they're often converted into farmland. Throughout most of the United States, we have taken our grasslands and turned them into farmland. Europe has done the same, and places in Asia typically, because grasslands tend to be great for farming. So we have tended to replace the native grasses with wheat, corn, rye, barley, you name it. We can pretty much grow it in these grassland areas. Once again, if you look at the temperature range, this does have classic 4 seasons. So you have winters that get down to freezing and summers that get up to quite hot. Same type temperature we get here in Florida. But they also get down below freezing. And you see the water sort of varies a bit. They get less rain in the winter months and a little more rain in the summer months, but it's this varied out. Not like the savanna where you saw a very specific lot of rain, no rain. The picture you see here, we turn it into farmlands. This grassland makes great. So we've got rid of all of that normal, natural grass, wild grasses that grow, and replaced it with rows and rows and rows of wheat, monocropping. And monocropping really can be particularly bad for the soil. If you're a farmer, it's the best way to go. It's the most cost productive way. But for the land, it's kind of one of the worst. Then we have the Arctic tundra. The Arctic tundra, type of grasslands because we don't have trees. Not as much precipitation, and most of the precipitation up in the tundra comes in the way of snowfall. So the snowfall gathers, but then in the spring months it melts out. Anyway, in the tundra, plants are very close to the ground where they can get close to any kind of warmth that is there. When it does grow, it's a very short summer. Like this is like 6 to 8 weeks of summer, and that's the only growth period. Animals that live there tend to have very thick fur, obviously to be warm. And we also find a unique feature there that we call the permafrost. This is the underground soil, and it stays frozen. The top few inches actually thaw out in the summer, but you dig down very far at all, and the ground stays permanently frozen, the permafrost. Also, we talk about the alpine. Some people talk about it mountain biome. Some people say they're really the same biomes, but instead of it being over an area from the equator up to the North Pole or South Pole, it's up the mountain range. So down at the bottom, it might be like tropical, and up at the very top, it can be like the Arctic. But we refer to it as alpine. So you could have alpine tundra as well, where you just find these grass areas above the tree line, but before just the pure rock line or snow line where we find no life. So we find tundra really in two places, in the Arctic regions and Antarctic, and up in some alpine, very high mountain areas. These grasslands, and there, as we look at here, very little water, right by the graph. The blue is very low and wavering. And the freezing point, no, it only dips above it for just, once again, about 8 to 12 weeks that it's above the freezing point in these areas. Most of the time it stays completely frozen, and we get kind of some little bit of snow, a little bit of rain in the summer, but it's very little, hence really, really short grasses and flowers and the blooming. Chaparral. Now, we talked about desert. In a sense, that was what we might really refer to as true desert. Very, very little water. The chaparral is a type of desert, but it's very specific. It occurs in coastal regions that border a desert. So where we have inland a little bit, very little water is getting, we have desert or true desert. Between the coastline and there, where we are getting some moisture coming in off of the coast, we get this chaparral. We often refer to it as a Mediterranean style climate because it surrounds the entire Mediterranean Sea area. It has very dense growth of kind of low-lying evergreens, things like rosemary plants. A lot of our herbs grow in these areas. They do have some small trees, and they tend to have very thick leathery leaves, once again protecting from water loss. The same with a lot of our herbs. They have oils. You take rosemary and rub it and smell it. Ooh, it smells nice. It's the oils in it that you're smelling. Chaparrals tend to have thin soil, not very good soil, and they have adapted to deal with the occasional fires. This leathery flesh will burn, but it comes back, and some of the twigs of it will resprout. So they've adapted to these common fires or little wildfires that run through the area. But chaparral is a type of desert, but it's very specific. Mediterranean style climate. In America, we have some on the southern end of California, also has this chaparral type climate. Low-lying stuff, little evergreen plants and trees, but prone to wildfires. And then we talk about the forest biomes. Forest biomes take up really a large chunk of the biomes. Once again, forests are dominated by trees. Like you can't see the tree for the forest, the old adage. But forest, trees, lots of them. Tropical, we tend to find the tropical rainforest. In the temperate areas where it's cold, too hot, we tend to find deciduous forest, mostly. And in the very cold regions, above 60 degrees latitude, we tend to find taiga or boreal conifer forests, cone-bearing, like pine trees. These are three broad ones that we run into. Now, the northern coniferous forest, known as boreal or taiga, as you see, the rainfall, they get a little bit more rain in the summer months than in the other, but it's a little bit scattered. And much of the year they're below freezing, and they never get real warm. You know, the warmest days up in there are around 70 degrees for us, or about 20 degrees Celsius. But these coniferous or cone-bearing plants. So that's in the very cold north area. The tropical rainforest. Tropical means it's going to be in the tropics, from 0, the equator, to 30 north, or from 0 to 30 south. So this 30 to 30 band are where we find our tropical rainforest. As long as we get enough rain, so once again we get a lot of sun, insolation causes the water to evaporate, rise, and it tends to begin to cool, and it rains right there. So we get a lot of rain in this area around the equator. The tropical rainforest tends to have this stratification of specialized plants and animal niches. We talk about the floor of the forest, or the understory. Then we talk about things being up in the trees, and then they're up in the tops of the trees, the canopy. And then there is an emergent layer, if you have trees that really pop up above the canopy. So you have this emergent layer, the canopy layer, you have a layer right below the canopy before you get on the ground, and then you have on the ground, which we call the understory. And different things kind of live in these different strata so that they don't have to compete with each other as much. Now it's very hot and very rainy all the time there. So we get a rapid recycling of the soil nutrient. Not a lot of soil nutrients, the ones that are there get cycled, pulled back into the plant life very quickly. Most of the nutrients in a rainforest are actually in the plants, not in the soil. This is different from the deciduous forest, where it's the other way around. And then obviously we have heard and learned about a lot of different human impacts on these, but we won't go into a lot of them now because they're the same ones. Human population, growth, deforestation, fragmentation, etc. Now, from the chart, you can see lots of rain, but there definitely is kind of a wet season and a dry season. Typically from May to June, the rains begin to fall off, and they're a little less through July, August, and then it begins to pick up more again. But you notice the temperature line pretty flat, stays the same year round. So this picture here is trying to show some of that strata area. On the ground layer, you have some animals that live and feed there, and they're down on the ground, and some getting on the small plant life, some living up in this just under the canopy. And then many things live in that true canopy, but some animals prefer the very tippy top, which we call the emergent layers. You'll have a tree that really pokes up high here and there. That's the emergent layer, and some things prefer to get there out of this bigger competition. So we get this strata of different plants and therefore different animals in the tropical rainforest. Now, in the temperate zone, once again, think, bottom end of Georgia up to Canada, or the same between 30 and 60 all around the globe, north and south. Now there's a lot more north than 30 than south. South America is one of the only ones, and Australia gets into it a bit. But here they have to deal with temperature range from very cold to very hot. So cooler temperatures, but there's abundant moisture. There's enough rainfall. So we get a forest. They tend to have very broad leaves, and they're deciduous. They fall off in the winter. It's a strategy to survive the very cold. They drop the leaves and the plant kind of goes dormant, and then it grows during the spring and summer months. It tends to have a slow rate of decomposition. Once again, in the summer things will decompose quicker, but in the wintertime not so much. And humans have impacted these dramatically for taking down the forest. We want to cut the trees down, but also the mountain areas, we tend to do a lot of mining as well. So we've cut them down just for areas to go, we've cut them down for farmland, and we cut them down just for trees sometimes, but lots of various things. Now with the chart, as we look at this one, now this is showing a deciduous forest, a classic in the autumn when the leaves change color. But notice the rainfall, fairly steady, But the temperature range again goes from down to at or near freezing, hot in the summers, cold in the winters. Depending on where you are in these, that can vary. Many places it goes below freezing for a lot of the winter months. It's a pretty broad range. If you're down near the 30th parallel, then it doesn't get down to freezing much. If you're up near the 60th parallel, there's a lot of time below freezing. So this is an average of the whole kit and caboodle. You get into a specific area and it's going to look different. Then we have our coniferous forest. We're going to really sort of break these down into two. If it's enough rain, then it becomes a temperate rainforest. But these are characterized a lot by still evergreens and pine trees. In the United States of America, our Pacific Northwest, like up around Oregon, Washington State, etc., and then going on up into Canada, is this temperate rainforest. Lots of rain, so therefore it's a rainforest, and then it gives way to deciduous forests a little around. These tend to be very scattered. There's very few of them. Some around New Zealand, Australia, some around the Pacific Northwest, and I think there's a few cases up in northern Europe that have some temperate rainforests. But these are very few. It's one of the smaller biomes that we have. They do have enough rainfall and or a fog. A lot of times it's just moisture coming in the way, coming in off the coast. It hits the cold area, condenses, turns to fog, but it provides enough moisture for the evergreens to survive. And then we also just have the taiga or boreal forest. These are the very cold areas up above, up into Canada, across up into like Norway, Siberia, etc. These are our taiga. Coniferous, cone-bearing forests, and they're south of the Arctic tundra. So we kind of have polar ice, tundra, and then we get this large pine forest. Once again, lots of Siberia up through northern Europe, and also North America up through large tracts of Canada. We find this taiga, cone-bearing plants, very cold winters, very short summers. And once again, the growth rate tends to be pretty small. Taking us to our mountains. Now, mountains are interesting because they don't really have one biome associated with them, typically. The Appalachians of North America tend to have deciduous forest all throughout them because they're pretty short, low-lying mountains. But when we get true high mountains like the Andes out through Chile, the Himalayas, the Olympic or Rocky or the Alps in Europe, then these mountains have really their own sort of systems going on. So large portions of the world's forests are actually found in these mountain ranges, in this case even the Appalachians. And they tend to be little islands of biodiversity because they're habitats for some very specific species that live there, because some species really love those endozones, and you get some really interesting endozones in the mountains because you go very quickly from deciduous forest to pine forest to tundra, or the other way around. So it'll be one biome type here, but as you go up the mountain, you run into another biome type and another biome type, but in a very short space of time. Normally this happens over thousands of miles as you go from the equator up to the pole or down to the pole. But in this case, it's happening over a period of miles. So some of our highest mountains in the world are only 5 miles high. It's a very short region, but it helps. And mountains help to regulate the Earth's climate because of some of these features, and they wind up being a really big storehouse of water. Because as it rains or the snow gathers and the snow melts, the water runs off through the mountain areas, and it's a big storehouse. We can dam them up, or there's just high-level lakes, etc. But all through these mountains, we get some really interesting ecosystems, and then they play a big factor in storing of water for us to be able to drink. And we quite often use them for hydroelectric because the water can run really fast, spinning our turbines. Now, about 60% of the major terrestrial ecosystems are being degraded or used in a way that's unsustainable. Once again, if we're cutting down trees and planting new ones, it can be sustainable. If we're mining and replacing the land when we're done, it can be sustainable, but many times we're strip mining, we're cutting everything off, and then we're leaving kind of a waste when we're gone. So it depends. Some of these things can be sustainable, but about 60% of these ecosystems right now are being used in a way that's either degrading them severely or it's not sustainable. It won't be for the future. And this human footprint is simply spreading across the globe. Let's take a look at this picture here, and we're just going to run through a few ways humans are disrupting these. You could probably come up with many more ways. Deserts, we've been putting a lot of big cities in the deserts, and then also people go out on them in four-wheelers and things of this nature, but the cities wind up taking a lot of the water out of the water table, not left over for some of the plants. And then once again, deserts recover very slowly, so if we're out there freewheeling and four-wheeling and disturbing it, it can take years for that stuff to recover where we go through and damage some. Grasslands, we've already mentioned, one of the big things is we've turned it into farming. And one of the issues when you've got farming, you tend to plant one type of crop. It's more economical to just plant wheat and harvest wheat, but it's not as good for the soil. So turning our grasslands into farming and then monocropping tends to be particularly harmful. Our forest, once again, we mentioned, not going to hit a whole lot of it. We tend to go into our forest for the wood, and then we also take a lot of our water supply, fresh water, from the forest areas. Mountains, we tend to find a lot of minerals, so we do a lot of mining and also water supply from that as well. So these are just some of the ways humans have disrupted and are continuing to disturb our land. And once again, we need some of the services that are there. We just need to find a way to do it that's sustainable for our ongoing future. We're going to wrap up with some of the big ideas that this chapter went through. Climate differences are largely determine the type and location of these biomes. It's temperature and rainfall. If you tell me what its average temperature and what the average rainfall, I can pretty much tell you what type of biome it'll be, especially in the big ones: desert, forest, grassland, etc. Earth's terrestrial ecosystems provide important economic and ecosystem services. All these different ecosystems provide us with very needed things, whether it's food, water, lumber. We just need to make sure we utilize them in a way that's sustainable for the Earth's future, because our current activities are degrading and disrupting many of these. So we can disrupt the ecosystem, and by disrupting the ecosystem enough, it harms the ecosystem services which we're dependent on for our very survival. Land biomes, weather, climate, and the biomes that are created by them. This is going to wrap it up for Chapter 7. Join me next time in Chapter 8 when we look at the aquatic ecosystems. Take care, guys.